All right, we're ready to implement authentication and authorization. Now, in order to speed things up, I've attached another zip file to this lecture, and this is the starter code for the lectures in this section. So this is basically the incomplete version of the project that you downloaded earlier. So when you run this application with ngserve, this is what you're going to get. You can see my name is not displayed here. All these links are visible at all times. If you go to login and login, nothing is going to happen because my name is not replaced here and these links are still visible. So we're going to get this application and add authentication and authorization to it. Now, before we get into the implementation details, I want to overview a few things about this project. So let's go to app.module. Here in the imports array, you can see we have a few routes, the default route, as well as admin, login, and no access. Pretty simple. I didn't want you to spend time recreating all these components and routes. That's why I provided you with the starter code. Now look at the providers array. Here we have order service, which is a very simple service for getting the list of orders from the server. Next, we have auth service, which we use for implementing login and logout. Now let's take a look at the implementation of the service. So auth.service.ts. So a very simple class that is dependent upon the HTTP service. Here we have a login method that is kind of half implemented. We're going to finish it in this section. We also have logout and is logged in methods here. But again, they are not implemented. They're kind of half baked. Now back in app module, after auth service, we have a few providers that are purely for implementing a mock backend, as you can see from my comments here. So you don't need to add this in a real world application. Now let's see how I have implemented this mock backend. So let's go to fake-backend.ts. So here I've exported a function called fake backend factory. This function takes two parameters, a mock backend and base request options. Now, before we get into more details, I just want to let you know that you don't ever have to write code like this. So don't worry if it's a little bit confusing. This is purely for demonstration, okay? So here I've declared this variable token, and I have set this to a valid JSON web token that I extracted from jwt.io. Now, if you scroll down, on line 15, you can see my comment, fake implementation of /API/authenticate. So here we have some basic logic to check the URL of the request. So if the request URL ends with /API/authenticate and the request method is post, that basically means the client has sent an HTTP post request to this endpoint. Now here we want to validate the username password, and if they're valid, we want to return a JWT, okay? So here you can see I have hard-coded this email and password. So if the client sends these credentials, then we're going to return a response, and we're going to set the status of this response to 200, and in the body, we're going to put this token. Otherwise, we're going to return a response without a token. Now here I've set the status to 200, which means okay. It would be better to set it to 400, which means bad request. That is invalid username or password. But that doesn't really matter for the purpose of this section. So all this logic is for implementing a fake API endpoint like this. After this, on line 37, you can see my next comment, fake implementation of /API/orders. So I'm doing something very similar. I've defined the API endpoint here, and then I'm checking to see if we have an authorization header in the request. So if we have an authorization header, and in this header we have a valid token, then we're going to respond with the list of orders. So here we have a response object, the status is 200, and in the body we have the orders. Now for this demo, I have used 1, 2, 3. In a real world application, we're going to return order objects. Otherwise, if we don't have a valid authorization header, we're going to respond with 401, which means unauthorized. So once again, in a real world application, you're going to implement this logic on the server, not on the client, okay? Now, all this logic for implementing these API endpoints, you can see that I have wrapped them with a set timeout function. As you can see from my comment, I've used this to simulate an asynchronous call to the server that takes 1 second. So, as the second argument to set timeout function, you can see I've passed 1000, which is 1 second, okay? Now, one more thing before I finish this lecture. At the end of this file, I have exported an object called fake backend provider. Note that this object has 3 properties: provide, use factory, and depth, which represents dependencies. What is this? Well, let's go back to app.module. Here in the providers array, earlier in the section about consuming HTTP services, we used a provider object like this. An object with 2 properties: provide, let's say error handler, and use class app error handler. Remember that? So with this object, we told Angular that wherever you need to provide error handler, instead use this class, app error handler. So this is what we call a provider object. Now here, instead of use class, we can use factory. And we set this to a function that will create an instance of this class. In this case, error handler. Okay? Now let's delete this and go back to our fake backend. This is our provider object. So with this, we're telling Angular, hey, whenever you need to inject an instance of the HTTP class, use this factory function. Remember factory? So earlier when I talked about observables, I talked about factory methods. Factory methods or factory functions create objects. So here, fake backend factory is a function that will create an instance of the HTTP class. And you can see that right here on line 57. This is the end of the body of our factory function. So here we're returning a new HTTP object, and as arguments we're passing backend and options. Let's see what these objects are. So if you scroll up to the top, this is our fake backend factory that takes 2 parameters, mock backend and base request options. So we take these arguments and modify them to respond to those fake API endpoints. And then finally, at the end of this function, we return a new HTTP object with these arguments, okay? Now back to our provider object, we have a third property, dependencies. And these are the dependencies of our factory function. Angular needs to know these before it can call this factory function, okay? So that's all about the starter code and the fake backend. Next, we're going to start implementing authentication.